This tutorial will take you through an example for assignment number 11. In this assignment, we'll be looking at producing a composite drawing. And for our purposes, a composite drawing will be a drawing that's made up of two or more drawing types in one single image, and also a drawing that combines two or more representation techniques. So for my example, I'm going to be producing a section perspective of the model that I was working on last week. And I'm going to combine a rendering with some line drawings and fills in Illustrator. So let's begin. You'll start by modeling your project, and then you'll do some preliminary research and see where exactly you want to cut the model if you're going to produce a section perspective. So I've already gone ahead and done that. So I'm going to use my cut plane command. I'll select my model, and I'm going to draw the cut plane where I want to produce a cut in the model. Okay, and you can see it made a surface that cuts through the entirety of that model. I'm going to move it over just a little bit. And now I'm going to use the split command to split the entire model by that surface. So I'll type in split, select the entire model, hit enter, and then select my cut plane, hit enter, and it'll work for a while to cut the objects. Okay, once it's done splitting, you can delete the objects that you no longer need. I recommend making a copy of the entire model first, or at least doing a save as, so you can always go back to the original if you'd like to. So I'm going to make a crossing window, select everything on this side except for my sunlight, and delete it. I'm going to delete the surface as well. So now you can see we made a cut through the model. Okay, now I can navigate around and find a desired view. I suggest if you're going to be rendering this image, you might consider, as you can see when it was cut, all of the solids now are hollow at their edge. So you can go through and make surfaces for those edges or cap them using the cap command. I'm going to leave them open because I'm going to produce a fill in my composite image that's going to cover that up. But I'll go through now and set an image and save that image and do some preliminary rendering. Okay, you can see from the preliminary rendering that the lighting up here is pretty good. It's a bit dark down in these spaces here, so I'm going to add some interior lights to that portion of the rendering. Another thing I want to point out is I'm using a section perspective where I'm kind of looking straight on, so it's a one-point perspective. That works for this project because there are things that I want to show given this view, but you and your projects might very well kind of do an angular perspective, something like this, so you get more information both on the building volume and the context as well. So just keep that in mind. How you rotate and construct your view for your section perspective is really important, and it doesn't have to be a straight on one point as I'm showing here. So let's take a look at how we add some lights. We went over this briefly in the last tutorial. I'm going to put a point light in. So I want to place it in plan first. And then I'll move it in one of my elevation views. And then I'll make adjustments to that light here. Okay, so I'm going to adjust the intensity of the light slightly and bump it up to 40. And then I'm going to copy the light into all of the other zones within the project. Then I'll make some adjustments to the height over here in the right view. And now that I have that set, I'll produce a final rendering, and then we'll take a look at doing some overlays. Okay, once you have your render, you'll save it as a Targa file. I've already done that. You also notice that because I had a reflective metal material for the different surfaces in my model, light would have bounced off it in a pretty extreme manner, leaving a lot of hot spots. So in the final rendering, we do get some specular difference, but I have gone into my lights and I have turned off the effect specular, which tones all the lights down a little bit. So that's one way to control how the lighting will affect your rendering. Okay, now that we have that done, I want to produce two different sets of line work. The first thing that I want to produce is a section cut, which I will use to fill in my composite drawing. So I'll type in section, I'll pick all of these objects, hit enter, and then I'm going to draw the section and turn on project exactly on the edge of the object. This will ensure that I create a section that aligns perfectly with my rendering. Okay, so I am going to turn those lines to a new layer. Make a new layer here. Okay. And I'll turn everything else off so we can see what that looks like. Alright, so there's my section cut. I'm going to select the points because I don't need those. Delete. Now I'm going to do a make 2D. Remember, I've set my view, so if I rotate back here, do a make 2D of those lines, just those lines. Okay. And if we zoom in, we get that line work in that perspective view. So then we don't have to worry about rotating anything or adjusting the lines. So I'll go through and clean this up. Get rid of the lines that I don't want. Trim the corners. Make sure everything's nice and perfect before I export to Illustrator. But I want to make one more set of line work first. Let's turn everything back on. Go back to my section perspective. Make sure I'm in the proper view. Okay, that's good. And now I'm going to do a make 2D drawing. I'll select my model. Make sure I click in the section perspective view so I'm making 2D of that view. And then I'll hit enter. I'm going to turn on show tangent edges just to make sure that tangent lines are visible. Click OK. And I have a 2D drawing now of my object. So I'll use these lines as well to layer in over the top of the rendering. I'm going to go through, you see there's some things happening here that I'm going to have to edit. So I'll make some changes to the line work and then export those to Illustrator. And then we'll start to layer things together. Okay, so I've gone through and cleaned up the line work in Rhino using the trim, extend, fillet, and erase commands. So you can see I just have the lines that I want left. And I think it's easier to clean everything up in Rhino ahead of time to ensure all the lines are connected properly and there's no gaps, so that when you bring them into Illustrator you don't have to do any editing. I'll export these and we'll look at the next steps. Okay, I have my Targa open in Photoshop. It's at this point that I'd go through and make any edits to the image that I might need to do. But it looks good right now, so I'm going to double click on the layer to unlock it. Click OK. Go to my channels and hold down Control and click on my alpha channel. And I'll go back to my layers and do select inverse and hit the delete key. So that removed all of the sky for the image. Now I can save this as a PSD and I will use that to open up in Illustrator and begin layering things in. Okay, I've opened up my PSD rendering file, my Photoshop file, in Illustrator. So that's this here. And then I also have my line work for the Make 2D and the line work for the section. So I'll start by grabbing the line work for the section, bringing it into my render file. I'm going to create a new layer, call that section. And since I brought that object in on that layer, I'll just drag it up and make sure it's on the correct layer. Okay, so I'll scale this to the appropriate size. Using the scale tool, I will drag the anchor to the corner and then hold down Shift and scale everything until it meets the other corner. Okay, that looks pretty good. I'm going to adjust the line weight just for a second to make it look a little bit thicker so I can see what I'm doing. Okay, I'm going to turn off the background layer and I'm going to give the section cut a fill. So I'll select everything and go to my live paint bucket. I'll click inside to activate it, and then I'm going to pick a bright color to fill in the section. So I'll double click on my color picker and let's try green. Then I can click on the inside and start to fill in that section cut. And now I want to turn the lines completely off just so that we have the section color. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, maybe green isn't the best color choice. It blends in a little bit too nicely with the background image, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to try a reddish color. Okay, that's looking a little bit better. Alright, now I'm going to grab I'll lock this layer, add a new layer, call it Make 2D. I actually want that beneath the section layer. I want the section layer to be on top. So I'll grab my Make 2D and bring that into the drawing. And again, I'll do the same thing. I'll position it and then use my scale tool. Move the anchor and then scale everything to the appropriate size. In this case, I want to leave the line work just as lines, so I can look at what thickness of line I want to use. Let's try 0.5. That's looking pretty good. Okay. The next thing I want to show you is how to bring in a person in Illustrator. So I have this person here. They're already cut out in Photoshop, so if I were to drag them in, you can see there's a transparent background. So I've opened them as a PSD. Now let's say I wanted to make an outline of this person. All I would need to do is select the image and go up here to Image Trace. And you can see it starts to produce a tracing of that image. Under my preset, I'm going to change it to silhouettes, and it gets a little bit closer to a full silhouette. And then if I open my image tracing panel, I can adjust the threshold. So I'm going to move that up to maybe about 250. Okay, that gives me a completely full silhouette. So I'll close that, and then I'm going to hit expand. So that's going to turn this tracing from an image into vector line work. And then I can double click on this and delete my rectangle that outlines the object. Okay, so now I have a person at scale. Now, I did not set up this rendering at eye level, so I'll have to do my best judgment here in actually scaling the person to the right size. Let's put her on another layer. Let's call this entourage. So you could do that for a number of different outlines. I'll just use one for this rendering. But you can see how that begins to work. Now the next thing I want to show you is if we wanted to put, let's say, a texture on the ground. Call that texture. And let's go to our swatches. I have some default swatches that I can load. Let's look under, I'm looking here under the Open Swatch Library, Patterns, Basic Graphics, and let's look at Basic Lines. Okay, you can see I have a bunch of different options for line patterns that are already preloaded in Illustrator. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a shape and then fill it with that pattern. So I'll use my pen tool, and I'll start to, I'm going to turn my smart guides off for now. Turn on caps lock so I have a better cursor. I'll start to trace around the ground plane. Okay, so I've gone through now, I've traced that outline, and I can pick different line types and begin to test them on the ground. That one looks decent. Now if I want to, it's a little bit bold, I can give that some transparency, so all I have to do is select the object and then adjust its transparency. So that makes it a little bit lighter. I could also do, in the same way we had looked at last week, some of these different effects on top of the image, so that allows the pattern to be distorted by the light and the shadow in the background. Reduce it a little bit more. So that's beginning to add some texture to the drawing. So the next thing I want to do is add a sky. So I'm going to make another layer again. And each time I'm doing something new, I'm going to lock the previous layer just to make sure I don't move it. I'll call that this layer sky. I'm going to put it beneath all the other layers because I want it to be the bottom image in my rendering. Okay, so if I click the gradient tool over on the left hand side and then click the gradient toolbar here on the right hand side, you'll see I get a slider option. These are my two colors that define the gradient. If I double click on the inside there and then pull the drop down tab, it might be set to grayscale. You can change it to CMYK. And that will give you the option to select some colors. So I'm going to leave that one as white. And then for this one, I'm going to select a blue. Now, depending on where you pull the gradient slider, that's how the gradient's going to appear as you draw it. You can also add other tabs into the gradient slider as well. So let's say I wanted it to change from a green to a blue. By adding other tabs in there, you can affect the way that the gradient shifts over the course of the image. Okay, let's try it, see what it does. Okay, so if I draw a rectangle, and let's go back here, I can rotate the angle of that gradient. Try a 60-degree angle. And I'm going to turn my smart guides back on. Make sure this rectangle fits perfectly in the corners. And then I will give this some transparency as well. It's a little bit too saturated. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do here is add some texture to these plain white buildings. So I've made a new layer called Buildings. I want it to be just above my rendered image and below everything else. So I've got a material map here that I've got from the material library. All I'm going to do is drag that image into the drawing. Now what Illustrator is doing is it's referencing the location of that image. So if I were to, for some reason, move the image out of this folder, Illustrator wouldn't be able to find it. Now there's a way that you can combat that. Illustrator does this by default to kind of save you on file size, but if you want to make sure that this image is actually in this Illustrator file and you won't have to find it later, click on it and at the top you'll see embed. So I'm going to click embed, and that'll ensure that the image stays in my Illustrator file. So I have this kind of placed generally. Again, I'm going to use some transparency, so I'm going to bring that down to 40%. And you can see the texture that I kind of want on these existing buildings. Now I don't want it to be everywhere, so I've got to draw a line that will allow me to make a clipping mask. So to do that, you just use your pen tool. And all you do is you trace, I'm going to turn my smart guides off here, you trace the part of the drawing that you want to keep. So in this case, I am just tracing around these existing buildings here. Now it doesn't matter that it's currently being filled in. I can adjust that later. Okay, so I'm just going to click on none for that. Now all I need to do to create a clipping mask, because I have this outline drawn, is just select the two objects. So because I have all my other layers locked, I'll just make a crossing window. And it's going to select my image and the line I just drew. Then I right click and select Make Clipping Mask, and it will clip out that texture only in the place of that outline that I made. So if I ever wanted to get rid of it, all I have to do is right click again and say Release Clipping Mask, and I can always go back in and adjust the line work if I didn't get accurate enough in the first go around. But that looks pretty good. I'm going to, again, try some of my effects. Overlay looks pretty good. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side, and we'll take a look at what the image looks like. Okay, you can see I added the pattern over the existing buildings on the right-hand side as well. So that's all I'm going to show you for this tutorial. I think the things to keep in mind are, if you can, work in Illustrator, because that'll allow you to change and adjust things more easily than in Photoshop. Always work in Vector if you can. So the only thing we adjusted in Photoshop was the initial rendering and cutting out the background of our entourage or our people. Then we brought everything into Illustrator and layered things together here. Other things that you can begin to explore is putting in more people. You can put birds in the sky. You can put trees in or landscaping conditions. I think the thing that you'll want to stress in your image, though, is to keep things relatively simple. So you can see for me, the heart of the project is this colorful series of boxes here, and everything else, the neighboring buildings and the ground plane, kind of recede into the background. They're just a simple texture. Keep that in mind when you're placing your entourage as well. Simple outlines are nice. Very simple trees tend to make things look better and not detract from your overall image. Okay, so I expect to see your composite images having much more information and much more detail than mine, but this will get you started on how to do the various techniques to accomplish that.